Good afternoon and welcome to this week's episode of the Freedom to Buy podcast presented by SuperNet. I'm Joe Dworsky, the president of retail banking for SuperNet, which is the only payment network that enables true credit card solutions for the cannabis industry for both merchants and consumers. Each week, our podcast will take you behind the scenes of banking, finance, payments, and technology to help educate both businesses and listeners like yourself on how to make the most of your purchasing power in the world of credit. My next guest is the founding partner of Cannacore Group and PS Law Group, primarily focusing her practice on competitive licensing and compliance in the cannabis industry on a multi-state level. Please welcome to today's show, Paula Savchenko. Paula, welcome.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you for having me on today.
Well, thank you for taking the time out of your busy day. I love your name, Savchenko. Can you tell us what the origin of your surname is?
Yeah, so we're originally from Minsk, Belarus. That's where I was born. And then my family moved over to U.S. in 93 to Cincinnati, Ohio. We were originally supposed to go to L.A. and then ended up landing up in Ohio.
Okay. And then how'd you get to South Florida?
So we came down here every year for vacation and also a soccer tournament and to Fort Lauderdale. And I always was like, oh, I really want to live there. I love it. And would really look forward to coming down here. And then one of the schools that I applied to was Nova. And then I got a soccer scholarship there as well. So then I ended up choosing to go here and then went to law school at Nova as well, and then ended up staying after school.
A lot of Northerners like myself have, migrated down south. So let's start, learning more about, your business and how you got into the business. Can you share with our listeners how you decided to focus on the cannabis industry, and how you got started in law and cannabis law, more specifically?
I started working for an administrative law firm undergrad, and they were doing regulatory compliance and licensing for several industries, pretty much every industry. And the partner that I was working under was mostly focused on regulated substances at that time, so liquor, fuel, tobacco. Then when I was in law school, I was like, hey, why don't we get involved in cannabis? Because I took a class that was focused on the cannabis industry. And I told that partner, why don't we get involved? And he's like, look, I don't have bandwidth to deal with it right now, but why don't you get involved? So then I started going to networking events and following what was going on, and just met some of the right people, and then got involved pretty quickly. Actually, before I passed the bar exam, I ended up working with a couple groups on their applications for licenses in Florida. And then from there, it kind of just spiraled and went to other states. So here we did Missouri, Illinois, West Virginia.
So you've really expanded, it sounds like, throughout the country with your current practice. Can you tell us about your Cannacore Group, and I guess what was the catalyst to form the firm at such an early time in your career?
I have a really good relationship with the firm that I was with, and I also felt like I was bringing in the work and doing the majority of the work. So I just kind of decided, why don't I start my own thing, and that's fully focused on cannabis. And that way I'm kind of able to, take on more and have more of a focus there and kind of control my schedule more and grow my team. So
okay. Makes sense.
That kind of was the catalyst. And then I would say I saved for about 6 months before I was able to actually make the leap to go on my own. I ended up going on my own at a good time. There were several applications that were coming up on the multi-state level. So
when did you guys start your firm? What year?
February 2021. So when I started out, I would say I wanted my main focus to be on working with groups in the industry on multi-state expansion. So identifying new opportunities, tracking that, and then applying for licenses in new states. And we've stayed with that. I would say, 95% of our work is focused on multi-state expansion with groups. So the majority of what we do is, Cannacore Group is the consulting firm that handles that multi-state expansion arm. Mm-hmm. And have the legal side that handles some of the legal work that's related to that, and also litigation. So if either our clients don't get the licenses or they work with someone else and they don't get the license, there's an official appeal process to go through to appeal the denial of the license. And so we handle those types of lawsuits as well. And right now we're working with two groups in Florida that applied for applications in the prior round. We didn't write their applications, but we're now representing them in their litigation, appealing the denial of the license.
So tell me and share for our listeners, you have Cannacore Group and you have obviously PS Law Group. The law group obviously handles the licensing, the regulatory, filings and whatnot. How do you work with a client on the consulting side for Cannacore Group, and what are you offering? What types of services do you offer these clients?
We work with groups that are interested in expanding in the cannabis industry. So basically, a group would come to us and say whether they're involved in the industry already or not. Sometimes we work with investors, sometimes we work with multi-state operators, and they would come to us and say, look, we're looking to get involved in these kinds of markets, let's say, recreational or medical or more competitive, these kinds of markets. Can you please put together a plan for us on which markets fit this criteria? So we charge to put together a plan. And then from there, we get on a call, go over, what states we think would be best, and then help the client to make a decision on which states they should apply in. Then once we make a decision, then we manage that application process for them, bringing in local partners, depending on the state. Sometimes you'll need real estate infrastructure or a lobbyist or, let's say, working with nonprofit groups. So we'll identify all of that for them, manage it, and then write the application. And then sometimes that also goes with, there's some legal work that's related, like, for example, leases or operating agreements. We'll handle that depending on the client and the state, and then submit the application. And then if and when you get the license, then we work with you on the regulatory compliance side as well. We have the cannabis side, and then we also have the psychedelic side, where we're doing pretty much the same thing with groups that want to apply for licenses right now for psilocybin, but eventually there's going to be more licenses.
Now, is this strictly for multi-state operators and single, dispensaries? Is strictly that vertical, or do you also do consulting in other verticals within the cannabis?
So we work with other verticals within the cannabis sector. We work with testing labs. We work with the hemp space. We work with ancillary services other than testing. I would say the majority of our client base is multi-state operators or, single or multi-state operators, or those that are looking to be a single or multi-state operator. But we do work with other groups as well.
In terms of the multi-state operators, how many states are you currently operating in? I mean, are your multi-state operators usually domiciled in Florida and they expand, or you're dealing with, multi-state operators that have domiciled in different states throughout the country and then expanding?
I would say both. We have some based in Florida and looking to expand outside of, and then others that are based in other states and looking to expand outside of there.
How many states are you currently operating in? I mean, do you actually...
So we've worked in 10 states total on competitive applications. We have an 85% success rate. Right.
That's terrific.
We're working on applications in New York and Maryland. Those are applications that are coming up. They're going to be due very soon. We're also working on an application in North Carolina that North Carolina they don't have their laws in place yet, but we typically recommend for a state that's very competitive like North Carolina, that's only going to have probably 10 licenses to get started at least a year out.
You hit on the success rate that you've had, 85%, in attaining these competitive licenses. Can you share with our listeners or explain to our listeners what is competitive licensing and what are some of the obstacles you have to, overcome in terms of applying for these licenses?
It's going to be different for every state, right? Like, for example, there are some states that are on a lottery basis. And so there isn't really a competitive component to it because, I could put in an application that's great, that if it was scored, it would get, the really high percentile. And somebody else could put in an application that is just checking the marks. So in lottery applications, typically aren't having that competitive process, but there's still some things that you can do to give yourself a better shot. For example, there's like social equity components or ways that you can get bonus points. So it's still important to work with someone that knows what they're doing on that side. And then on the competitive side, that's what I'm talking about there is when there's only a limited number of licenses that are going to be given out, and those applications that are submitted are going to be scored. And so for that, what people are typically looking for, or what the states and regulators are typically looking for, and the applicants should be including, is making sure that they have strong local connections through their lobbyists, through their local partners. So sometimes getting like a celebrity local partner or somebody that has a lot of nonprofit or other charitable experience, relationship with a university, or like really deep farmer roots, like generational farmer. You want to make sure you have that. Then agreements with schools and nonprofit groups, making sure that you've tied down real estate. So if you're applying for a vertical license, cultivation, manufacturing, and retail, you're going to need, ample amount of real estate for your cultivation, manufacturing in a warehouse or some type of indoor structure. And then also retail, depending on the state, how many you can operate, then you'll want to identify the full amount that you can operate in that state.
There's a lot that goes into the process of applying for a license and getting, a dispensary opened, it sounds like.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's a lot of work, and that's why we recommend to our clients to start early. There's a lot of moving pieces. And lastly, I was going to say the biggest, most important thing is to make sure that your business plan makes sense. So you want to make sure that the amount of cannabis that you're saying you're going to produce is doable in the facility that you have, and it makes sense with the patient count, that the prospective patient count.
Based on this process that you just laid out, from start to finish, what does the timeline look like? How long does this take usually?
It depends on the state. I would say the minimum is about 2 months and maximum is about 2 years. So it's going to be anywhere between there.
It's a big spread.
Yeah, it is. I would say a good sweet spot is 6 months to a year and a half out. Like 6 months to a year out. I would say like ideally we want to be about a year out before we're submitting the application.
Which state has the heaviest lift currently in terms of this process?
Florida has a pretty competitive application and there was a lot involved in it. Alabama does too. New York for the vertical licenses is going to be very difficult, and there's only 5, or they haven't said for sure, but around 5. I would say really any state that has like a really competitive number is going to be difficult.
Right. Now you said New York vertical license. What can you expand on what you mean by the vertical license?
Yeah, so there's going to be additional licenses given out in this upcoming round for vertical. Vertical means that you operate cultivation, manufacturing, and retail under the same license as opposed to just operating cultivation or just retail. And they're going to be giving out RO licenses, which are medical vertical licenses.
Okay, I see. Yeah, New York, I understand. I mean, they came on recently, in the last year, right? But I understand that
Yeah.
it's a process. It's a process in New York. I understand. It's been a little bit of a slow process, to say the least. Is that correct to say?
Oh, yeah.
So, can you expand? You talked about the licensing process, the competitive, licensing. Are those all the types of licenses that are, in the cannabis space, or are there different types of licenses specifically, for different verticals, whether it's a grower or a retail or so forth?
Yeah, so there's different types of licenses. So there's going to be, and every state's different how they deal with it. So some states that say, you know what, we only want to give out licenses that require the same business to cultivate, manufacture, retail, and transport. And there's no wholesale allowed between the license holders. That's how Florida is. Then there's other states like Alabama that say, okay, we're going to have some vertical licenses, and then we're going to have other specific licenses that allow for people to just cultivate, just manufacture, just retail, or just transport. And so it just depends on the state. Some states even have, like, for example, New Jersey has all of those types of licenses. And then within each license type, they have an allowance of, how much cultivation space you can have. So different tiers of that cultivation license, where you can only have, I think the lowest is 5,000 square feet, and then it goes all the way up to 150,000 square feet.
Given the landscape today and the challenges from a regulatory perspective and just the overall economy that we're operating under, are you seeing a slowdown in people, wanting to get into the cannabis space and to get licensing, or just in general, people want to get into the space? Are you seeing that slow down as of late?
You know what? I am seeing that slowdown. I think, or about 2 years ago, 1 to 2 years ago, cannabis was still the hottest thing. Everybody wanted to get involved. I think a lot of that money has dried up, and that excitement has dried up for a couple reasons. I think a lot of people got burned in this industry. I think the money has gotten smarter than we can't really deny that we're either already in a recession or going into one.
Mm-hmm.
So that's obviously adjusted things. There's other hot and new things to get involved in now. I think cannabis is getting somewhat commoditized. And now we have the psychedelic space that a lot of investors have moved over into, that were comfortable with cannabis. And so, yeah, there's been a big shift, but it trickles down to, it trickles from new people coming in, and it also trickles to current operators, because the current operators are, we're going to see I think we're going to see a big M&A play here, where you'll see a lot of groups get, swallowed up by other operators because they just can't raise the money. It's really difficult to raise money right now. So everybody's kind of focused on, not everybody, but a lot of groups are focused on what they have and
Mm-hmm.
making sure that they can operate what they have well, as opposed to expand. And so it actually opens up a nice pathway for the groups that do have the money to continue to expand, because there's less competition on the application process. I mean, in Florida, if we would have had this application process, we had an application process earlier this year in Florida. And if we would have had this 2 years ago, I really think we would have had somewhere between 250 to 500 applications. And we only had 74 applications.
Really?
Yeah. And so it's a good thing and a bad thing at the same time.
Let's talk a little bit about the regulatory landscape, okay, and what's been going on in terms of, rescheduling, 280, safe banking, and how would you like to see that play out, and the obstacles in achieving those changes?
Yeah, so it's been really exciting for our industry to see this push forward, both the Safer Banking Act and also so much conversation and movement towards either a rescheduling or descheduling event. As far as, obviously I would like to see the Safer Banking Act pass. And I think that will absolve a lot of issues that we're having in the industry. As we were just talking about, it's so difficult to raise money. It'll open up institutional banking and all that, and break down a lot of barriers that are just holding us back as an industry. And so that's that side. And then as far as the rescheduling or descheduling event, there's so much back and forth between people in the industry. Well, what would be better? Any movement is better, but if I had to pick one, I would say I think that we should probably start with a rescheduling event and then have our regulations catch up to that and then move on to a descheduling event. But if I knew that there wouldn't, that it would take a long time to deschedule or I wouldn't have another shot, I would say let's just go straight to descheduling and we'll let the regulations catch up eventually. The Safer Banking and the rescheduling or descheduling event will work together and really help the industry. With banking, with insurance, with, I'm sure with payment processing, it just opens up a whole new world for us.
No, I agree. There's been a lot of talk about 280E going away if the DEA were to deschedule cannabis. Have you had many clients talking to you about this?
So there's been a lot of talk about that. And the question is, how is it going to be applied? Obviously, it will apply moving forward, but there's a lot of operators that are essentially using, so they owe hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not in taxes to the government. And they're not paying that because they're hoping that 280E will go away or won't apply to cannabis. And then that, the government will no longer enforce that. But I don't know if that's really going to be the case. So it's going to be a pretty interesting couple of years when we're watching how that's going to play out.
What are your thoughts about payments in the cannabis industry? You're dealing with all these, MSOs and different verticals that can use a payment solution. There are quasi solutions that are not really kosher. There is no true solution in terms of a credit card and a processor because all the majors have decided not to participate. So you have any thoughts on a payment solution for cannabis and what that would mean for the industry?
If we could have, like you said, we have payment processing now, but then there is this issue where credit cards can't be used, or if they are being used, people are eventually getting kicked off. It just creates another barrier that businesses in the industry are having to spend their time and energy focused on, okay, how do we get around this, as opposed to being able to focus that time and energy on something else. And if we could have, and then they're also getting, sometimes getting charged higher percentages because of the increased compliance risk that this industry has. And if we could have those barriers broken down and have payment processing with credit cards and people could pay with whatever they choose, then I think that will, it'll help the operators by being able to spend that time to focus somewhere else. And it'll also help by growing patient count or customer count in recreational markets. It will see more people be able to be involved in the industry.
We're on the same page on that one, that's for sure. It's an obstacle that needs to be overcome, and we're working towards that solution. I want to take a step back. We were talking a little bit earlier about, you're seeing a slowdown, in terms of cannabis. It's not as sexy as it was a couple of years ago. Psychedelics are picking up. Just for our listeners, can you just talk about the differences between, psychedelics versus cannabis?
That's a great question. So when psychedelics started picking up movement on, legalization efforts or decriminalization efforts, a lot of people in the cannabis industry were like, oh, great, this is going to be just like the cannabis industry. And that's not what we've seen. The psychedelic side, so just like what's included in psychedelics, right? I'm not going to list all of them, but I'll list them just so people have an idea. Psilocybin, MDMA, LSD, ibogaine, ketamine, those types of drugs. So they are scheduled. However, they're scheduled, some of them, they're able to, the way that they're scheduled, it's easier to do research on them to try to show the government why they should be legalized. And there's been a really big push from that, for that. And so ketamine is actually legal for certain uses. And then there's also a catch-all that doctors can use that sometimes they can prescribe it for other similar uses. And so that's how you're seeing ketamine being used in these ketamine clinics legally. But basically what the industry is pushing to do is to have other psychedelics be able to be administered in the same way. And so marijuana never was, okay, this drug needs to be administered in a clinic. Marijuana was always, I'm going to buy it and take it home. Whereas these psychedelic drugs, because they, researchers find that they can affect the way that they're psychoactive, right?
Mm-hmm.
They can be psychoactive. So there's more, you need to have more protections around them. And they are starting more with more focus on the medical side as opposed to just an automatic push to recreational.
Okay, that makes sense. I understand that you also serve on the board of Mr. Psychedelic Law and the Cannabis Law Accounting and Business. Can you talk about these boards that you serve on?
Yeah, sure. Mr. Psychedelic Law is an organization based in Florida that is pushing for decriminalization and legalization of psychedelic. They've started with psilocybin, are working towards others, basically have drafted legislation and put that in front of the right people in Florida and other states. And we really started that from the locality level because that's where the decriminalization starts.
Mm-hmm.
And then the legalization on the state level.
Well, this has been a great show, Paula. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to spend 30 minutes with our listeners to educate them on what you're doing at Cannacore Group, as well as PS Law Group. If any of our listeners want to contact you, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Yeah, sure. So my email is Paula, Paula, at Canna, Canna, Core, COREGRP.com. And then my phone number is 513-240-9338. And then you can also check out our website, www.cannacoregroup.com.
Okay, terrific. I'm sure you'll be hearing from a number of people. But so thanks everybody for listening to the Freedom to Buy podcast this afternoon, presented each week by SuperNet. You can learn more about our company by visiting our website at supernet.ai. You can listen to today's show as well as past episodes of Freedom to Buy at Cannabis Radio, as well as Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Please join us next week as we have our next guest on the Freedom to Buy podcast. Thank you and have a great afternoon.